From Georgia.
Madam President, May is the Military Appreciation Month. And in light of that, I come to the Senate floor to remind us all just how important our military is to our way of life. One of the blessings of being a United States Senator and being on the Armed Services Committee and a past member of the Foreign Relations Committee, I've had the privilege to travel, as you have, around the world, visiting with our men and women in uniform. I have concluded that the best, and I mean the very best, of what we produce here in America is in uniform around the world, worn by our women and men, protecting our interests and defending freedom around the world. There are only 6 reasons in the Declaration of Independence why 13 colonies got together in the first place, and one of those was to provide for the common defense. Today, the world is more dangerous than any time in my lifetime. Today, the United States faces 5 threats across 5 domains. This is much more complicated than the world has ever seen. Today, we measure the threats in this manner: China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, and terrorism. Across 5 domains, it used to be air, land, and sea. Unfortunately, today, it's air, land, sea, cyber, and now space. The tragedy, frankly, of our time is that we've treated space as a scientific endeavor over the last 30 years, and others who we now consider potential threats have treated it as a military domain. I grew up in a military town, Madam President. My father served in Germany in Europe during World War II. When World War II was ended, he joined the reserves and then was called up again in the Korean War. Spent a couple of years in Korea during the Korean War. I have his dog tags today in my office. They serve as a constant reminder of his commitment to defending our ideals and upholding our way of life here in America. And it reminds me that every single woman and man in uniform in our services today do the same thing. Today, I'm humbled to represent our men and women in uniform in the United States Armed Services Committee. I take that very seriously, as I know every member does. One of my greatest honors as a member of this committee and a former member of the Foreign Relations Committee, as I said, is to travel overseas. But the highlight in every one of those trips is not meeting with the head of state or the head of the military or the foreign minister. It was having dinner with people from my home state who are in uniform around the world. When President Obama was in office, the #1 request I heard from heads of state around the world was we need America to re-engage. At that time, America had withdrawn. We had created a vacuum. People weren't asking to be the world's policeman. They were asking us to basically re-engage and have a seat at the table and lead again. And after a decade of withdrawal from the world stage under the prior administration, America now is leading again. President Trump is re-engaged with the rest of the world. He's made it clear that American interests come first, but that doesn't mean, when we say America first, it doesn't mean America alone. Today, our allies trust us again, and our adversaries fear us again. President Trump has also taken action to rebuild our military after it was gutted during the prior administration. Under President Obama, spending on the military was cut 25%, and we saw the resulting drop in our readiness. In the last 2 years, we've updated defense spending by $80 billion a year. And as a result, in addition, we have avoided the use of continuing resolutions in each of the last 2 years, thanks to people on both sides of the aisle, Senator Leahy and Senator Shelby, who, the ranking member and the chair of the Appropriation Committee, worked diligently last year and made sure that we got defense funding done before the end of the fiscal year and without a continuing resolution. Because of that, readiness is on the rise again in the military. Modernization efforts, rebuilding our military is underway, and our men and women in uniform are safer around the world, #1, and have the resources they need to carry out their missions. I'm proud of the progress that we've made in just a very short period of time. Just in the last 2 years, our readiness has dramatically improved. However, a continuing resolution of any length for 2020, fiscal year 2020, will erode and undo a lot of the progress we've made just in readiness over the last couple of years. I'm really very concerned that this is a primary responsibility of ours here in the Senate and indeed in Congress. And it's one that we have not stood up to over the past, and we've got to do better than that this year. Mr. President, I believe that Secretary of the Navy Richard Spencer said it best when he described the impact of continuing resolutions. Since 1974 Budget Act was put into place, Congress has used 187 continuing resolutions as a release valve to fund the government in a temporary manner. Let me say that again. Since 1974, 45 years, we've used 187 continuing resolutions. Each one of those continuing resolutions is devastating to our military in so many ways that I'll get into in just a minute. Continuing resolutions are absolutely devastating to our military, both in readiness and the ability to rebuild our military. It's the most insidious thing Congress can do to our men and women in uniform. And many of us in here don't even realize the damage that a continuing resolution does to our military. I've questioned all three current service secretaries and their chiefs of staff, both publicly and in private meetings, about the operational impacts of continuing resolutions and funding uncertainty. Here are some of the responses. A continuing resolution, and I quote, would be a punch in the gut, unquote, according to Admiral John Richardson, Chief of Naval Operations. A continuing resolution, quote, would stall our progress on readiness and modernization. General Bob Neller, Commandant of the United States Marine Corps. Heather Wilson, Secretary of the Air Force, said the defense budget sequester did more, and I quote, did more damage to the United States Air Force and our ability to defend the nation than anything our adversaries have done in the last 10 years. And we did it to ourselves, unquote. Secretary of the Army, Mark Esper, I quote, fiscal uncertainty has done a great deal to erode our readiness and hamper our ability to modernize. If we do not modernize the force right now, we risk losing a future conflict against Russia or China. It's just that simple, end quote. Finally, Secretary of the Navy Richard Spencer said, and this is classic, I quote here, continuing resolutions have cost the Department of Navy roughly $4 billion since 2011. Since 2011, we've put $4 billion in a trash can, put lighter fluid on top of it, and burned it up, unquote. I don't know how to put it more clearly than that, Mr. President. CRs have a direct and immediate impact across the entire Department of Defense, from training to readiness to maintenance to personnel and, yes, to contracting. During a CR, training must be rescoped, scaled back, or discontinued entirely, meaning our warfighters are less prepared for battle and don't have the resources to defend themselves properly when in the heat of battle. Depot maintenance and weapons development are also delayed, resulting in costly delays, less lethality, and higher costs. Hiring and recruitment is put on pause, leaving critical gaps in workforce skill sets. Also, when we have the development of cyber capability and space capabilities now, we're just ginning up those capabilities, and CRs absolutely devastate these young, developing capabilities. Change of station moves for service members and their families are halted, creating unnecessary turmoil for families. Can you imagine? You've got kids. You're going to be put on a deployment overseas. The timing has got to be right to get your kids in schools over there. Well, if a CR happens to occur, and guess what happens around September 30th, the end of our fiscal year, and if your family is moving around that period of time, it could be held up because of that CR. That is very disconcerting to families already stressed under increased deployments and rapid turnarounds. The DoD cannot start new contracts or has to cancel, in many cases, existing ones. Now, that devastates the supply chain, Madam Chairman. When we look at the supply chain of the military after the devastating disinvestment of the last administration, one of the things that has to be rebuilt is the supply chain. The consistent funding of the supply chain is critical to the long-term defense of this country, and it's one we've taken for granted and devastated over the last decade. Additionally, the Department of Defense has outlined hundreds of critical projects that would be disrupted or even discontinued if a current CR is used this year. I can think of one right now. A very much in demand helicopter has been under development for the last few years. It's ready to go. It's ready to be sent to the troops in the field. And yet, if we have a CR come September 30th, it will be delayed 1 full year. Now, Madam President, we cannot allow this any longer. Clearly, CRs create inefficiencies and uncertainty that hurt the bottom line and our ability to fight. These funding disruptions weaken our strategic capability and shake the confidence and foundation of our nation's industrial base. Until 2018, the Department of Defense started 13 of the last 17 years under the standing of a current continuing resolution. 13 of the last 17 years, they started their fiscal year under a continuing resolution. Fortunately, for the last 2 years, despite other funding failures of Congress, we did not have to use a CR to fund the military. And that's been a major factor in boosting both readiness and our reinvestment and recap efforts. I hate to say it, but I believe we're staring down the barrel of a potential CR this year on September 30th. As we sit here tonight, Madam President, there are only 25 working days between now and 31 July. Why is that important? Because in the month of August, this body, along with the House, go back to their states. It's a work period in the state. That means that we won't be able to pass appropriation bills here because we won't be here. If we don't move this appropriation bill and get it passed by the end, I believe, of July, when we come back in September, there are only 10 working days in September, legislative working days. There is no way we're going to get it all funded in that time. Last year, at 31 July, we had only appropriated about 12.5% of the federal discretionary budget. We stayed here in August to the credit of the leadership, Senator McConnell. I believe that because of that, we went from 12.5% to 75% funding, including the Department of Defense, and therefore we were able to avoid a continuing resolution last year, as I've said. Mr. President, other people have said that the greatest threat to our national security is our own national debt. General Mattis, Admiral Mullen, there are various other people who have said that in positions where they should know. I would add one thing to that is devastating to our ability to defend this country, and that is the use of continuing resolutions. When we look at the domain threats and the natural threats that have evolved in the world right now, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and terrorism, I don't think any of that damages the military potentially as much as our inability here to provide consistent funding for our military. During Military Appreciation Month, I can think of no higher calling than for Congress to work diligently toward passing a defense appropriation bill. Now, first we have to pass the National Defense Authorization Act, which we're working on this week. All the subcommittees are passing their markups this week. We hope to move on that immediately. And I believe that will get passed here without much controversy. I know that leadership is talking about right now moving in a very intense manner with a critical sense of urgency to get this defense appropriation bill done. I applaud those efforts. I want to support it in any way I can. And I call on everybody in this body to be supportive of making sure that we can have, for the third year in a row, this is not a partisan issue, Madam President. This is about our men and women in uniform. And given that this month is Military Appreciation Month, what better time to face up to this potential and make sure that we don't have a continuing resolution come September 30th of this year. That's the least we can do for our women and men in uniform and fulfill the responsibility that our founders laid out in the Declaration of Independence when they outlined those 6 reasons why we were coming together. And the number one reason why we had at that time was to provide for the security of the United States of America. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.